"David, could you come to the party and keep an eye on Claire? I have work issues, I'll be late." "I don't want to leave her alone with all those office charmers," Brian asked over the phone. David felt lonely at that moment. It was a party in honor of Claire, a girl from the office. She worked as a secretary in a local law firm, one of the few, so it was expected that there would be several unmarried girls there. The party was in a large apartment. The front door was open. David entered, left his drinks in the kitchen, which was full of men and beer, and went to look for Claire. He saw her talking to some guy in the corner of the living room. The guy shrugged and walked away. When David approached Claire, she smiled at him. "I'm glad you're here. Brian is running a bit late. Some broken down van or something." "I know, he asked me to keep you company," David replied. Claire touched his hand. "Thank you for that. They're all trying to chat me up. Could you get me a drink? I don't want to go to the kitchen. It's like walking into a lion's den." David considered Brian's request a display of some paranoia, but decided to help his friend, as always. They had been friends since they were 4, almost 22 years now, always supporting each other. Brian helped David get through his first breakup when he saw his then-girlfriend Sharon kissing a guy named Charlie. David, in turn, supported Brian when he didn't make it into the football team at 13, and the coach said to come back next year when he would be taller, healthier, and faster. Together they started running, and the next year Brian made it into the team. Running helped David secure a spot as a rugby forward in the school team. Over the years of friendship, they got into various troubles, mostly because of broken windows and being late for classes. The headmaster was particularly displeased when they set fire to the trash can behind the sports pavilion, trying their first cigarette, which they threw away without putting out. A 2-week break from classes and additional homework on lung cancer research made David and Brian quit smoking forever. Years flew by, and now it was time for college. Brian studied business, while David focused on accounting. They continued to engage in sports, teasing each other. David called Brian Ponzi for his way of running with the ball and falling, pretending to be injured. Brian, on the other hand, teased David as a wild Neanderthal for his habit of tackling other players. Thanks to their regular workouts, the friends were in great shape. After completing their studies, Brian landed a job as an assistant to the assistant transport manager, which practically meant running errands in the office and occasionally acting as a driver. David became an assistant accountant at a local engineering firm, performing rather monotonous tasks with numbers. The young men's lives were filled with new joys, cars, beer, and girls. It seemed like the fun would never end. Over time, Brian's organizational skills and his ability to find ways to expand the business were noticed by the company. After a few years, he was promoted to deputy transport manager. David, on the other hand, discovered his talent for finding errors in numbers, whether they were accidental or intentional attempts to conceal something. Soon, he became the deputy chief accountant. The friends continued to tease each other, calling each other Van Balancer and Neanderthal playing with bones. One day, Claire entered Brian's life, who was a good friend of David. It was inevitable. The friends always knew that someday they would meet the girl of their dreams, and everything would change. David secretly hoped that he would be the first to find the one with whom he would spend the rest of his life. But fate had other plans. Claire was drawn to Brian. She made him more grounded and less reckless. Moreover, she was very attractive, short, with long straight black hair and a dazzling smile. David couldn't help but notice that she had an excellent figure, but he never made the first move because, firstly, he saw her as a friend, and secondly, he wasn't looking for a serious relationship. Brian and Claire had been dating for just over 2 years. 6 months ago, she moved in with him, but there were rumors that she hadn't sold her apartment but had rented it out. Now, standing at this party among dancing and chatting people, David felt that the evening could bring surprises. He headed to the kitchen for a drink for Claire, ready to defend her from persistent admirers and wondering when Brian would finally show up. Returning with rum for Claire, David, to deter any guy from approaching her, stayed by her side and talked to her about various things, including their relationship with Brian. "So when are you two getting married?" David asked unexpectedly. Claire blushed. Brian hints at it, but I keep telling him that I'm not ready yet, she confessed, as if revealing some secret. Don't get me wrong, I love him very much. He's kind, attentive, sweet, funny, and very good. David sensed that she was holding something back. In the past, he had also had some suspicions that things weren't all smooth sailing between Claire and Brian, but David never dwelled on that thought, thinking it was just his imagination. So what's holding you back? He insisted, feeling the tension growing between them. Claire suddenly became serious and placed her hand on his shoulder. Dave, she said, looking him straight in the eyes. I know you can keep secrets. Brian is wonderful, but it's like something is missing for me. David was taken aback. He had always thought that Brian and Claire were perfect for each other. You see, Oh God, this is so awkward, Claire whispered. You can trust me. I love you both like family. Claire looked up at the ceiling. He isn't very good in bed, she barely uttered. David stared at her in shock. Claire nodded. Could you somehow help? Rumors have it that you're doing well, David recoiled. Oh, no. I'm his friend, I can't. No, silly, that's not what I meant, Claire smiled. Just talk to him, give advice. David felt relieved, but the situation was still extremely awkward. He didn't know what to say. I love him, but I need more, you know? Claire's eyes glistened with tears. I need to think about this, David muttered. He quickly messaged Brian to find out when he would be back. David returned and handed Claire another drink. She drank half of it in one go. Claire mentioned she got a message from Brian. He would be back in 15 minutes. How long does he wind you up? Slowly and poorly. And then it all ends in 5 to 10 minutes, without any tenderness during the process, Claire replied sadly. David felt like she wanted to say something else but held back. He already had too much information in his head. Claire lightly touched his hand. If you could get him to talk about it with you, that would be a start. All right, I'll go get him a beer when he arrives, and you go touch up your makeup. I promise, I'll think about it, David replied. He understood why she couldn't talk about it with her friends. They would just say to dump him and find someone else, but she loved Brian. Thank you. Claire looked at David, placed her hand on his shoulder, and kissed him on the cheek. You're like the older sister I can chat with, but never had. Older sister? Okay, older brother you can chat with, but never had. All right, bro, Claire smiled and went to fix her makeup in the bathroom. David went and grabbed 2 bottles of beer. One for Brian, who was already standing behind him and clearly needed the drink. David handed Brian the bottle before shaking his hand. They had to do a manly hug with beers in hand. At that moment, Claire appeared, and Brian handed his bottle to David, who now stood awkwardly in the middle of the room with 2 beer bottles while Brian hugged and kissed his girlfriend. Brian apologized for being late and thanked David for taking care of Claire. He invited David to have a beer on Monday after rugby practice to thank him. David said it was no problem. He liked Claire as a friend, and he was always happy to chat with her, as he saw her less often than before when she wasn't Brian's girlfriend. But since Brian was offering beer, he didn't mind. Brian explained that he would have been even later, but when they were halfway through transferring goods from one van to another, the mechanic managed to start the first van. So instead of transferring everything back, he split the paperwork in half and sent 2 drivers. They were able to make up time and finish the job earlier. Now that Brian was here, David went to meet other people at the party and try to find available girls. He chatted with a few, even danced and exchanged kisses. He exchanged contacts with some, promising to call. Around 11:30, Brian and Claire found David to say they were going home as Claire was tired and wanted to sleep. Brian grinned foolishly and winked at David, hinting that no one would be sleeping. They asked if David wanted to take a taxi and go with them since he lived near Brian and Claire. He declined, letting the lovebirds leave and have fun. Well, at least one of them would definitely have fun. David stayed at the party until the very end and went home, still feeling a bit embarrassed. On Monday evening, he met Brian at the pub. Instead of standing at the bar as usual, Brian dragged him to a table. I think Claire is cheating on me, Brian blurted out without preamble. David froze. Damn. Why do you think that? She says she wants more fun, to try something new. I thought everything was fine between us. We have sex 2 or 3 times a week, but she finds it insufficient, David cautiously replied. He told Brian a story about Katie, a married woman who used him as a toy for her amusement. I didn't mind being a toy. The issue was that she lied about being divorced. David shared some advice with his friend on improving their sex life. Then he headed to the bar. He needed to stretch his legs and think. An ingenious plan came to his mind at the counter. Listen, he said upon returning, while you're away, look up ways to spice up our intimate life. Meanwhile, I'll keep an eye on Claire during her lunch break. I'll check the hotel near her workplace, the gym. Brian agreed with relief. The friends parted ways content. They had a plan of action. On Tuesday and Wednesday, David kept tabs on Claire at the hotel and gym. But on Thursday, something alarming happened. Claire headed straight to the elevator and went up to the 4th floor. An hour later, she came down with a young man. They pretended not to know each other, but David found it suspicious. He frowned, pondering how to break the unpleasant news to his friend. On Saturday evening, all 3 gathered at the pub. Claire gently scolded David for not calling or messaging any of the girls in her office, to which David replied that he didn't feel like it. While Brian was behind the bar, pouring drinks, Claire leaned towards David and said, I don't know what you told him last week, but it was definitely better yesterday evening. There's still a lot of work to do, but he seems more willing to talk about it. On Sunday morning, David went to watch Brian play football. Claire was there, as usual. He stood next to her, not too close. She wasn't his girlfriend, but it was nice to be near her. Not too insistently, he asked if things were getting better. She gave him a sidelong glance, smiled, and said, he talks about all sorts of nonsense, thank you. After the match, Brian caught David at the bar while Claire was touching up her makeup. Hey buddy, thanks for the advice. Googling how to improve my life led me to a bunch of women's magazines. Not what I was expecting. Damn, women are strange. Seems like they want to talk. Anyway, I have nothing to lose. If I want to marry her, I'll have to give it a try. Thanks, pal. You should follow your own advice. David replied in his usual friendly manner, get lost, idiot. On the following Tuesday and Wednesday, David once again kept an eye on Claire, but once again found nothing suspicious. However, on Thursday, he saw something similar to what he had seen last week, a young man exiting the elevator with Claire and heading towards the check-in counter. David entered the elevator with him. They went up to the 3rd floor. He exited the elevator simultaneously with him and tried to look confused. It wasn't difficult. He watched which room the man entered and found a quiet corner, hoping nothing would happen. He was wrong. About 10 minutes later, Claire came out of the elevator and headed towards the same room. David wondered what he should do now. What he had seen could easily ruin the relationships of the people he loved, but he needed solid evidence. David went downstairs and waited in the lobby. He decided to give her one chance and see what she would say. They both exited the elevator together, but this time, before they could separate, David stood in front of them. Claire's face fell. Oh, damn! The guy stepped towards him. Claire put her hand on his shoulder and shook her head. She looked at him and said, Richard, goodbye. We won't see each other again. Tension mounted with each passing second as the 3 stood in an awkward silence. David felt his heart pounding in his chest, waiting for an explanation from Claire. He hoped his worst fears wouldn't be confirmed, but he was prepared for any turn of events. Claire reached out her hand to him, and he noticed tears in her eyes. David stepped back with a bewildered look. She led him to the corner of the living room with a niche. David followed her. Claire's first words struck him to the core. Dave, this is exactly what you think. I completely surrender myself to your mercy. I will answer any of your questions, absolutely honestly and openly. And if in the end you decide to tell Brian about what you saw and what I will tell you, it will be entirely and completely my fault. You won't be blamed for anything. With these words, she took the phone and called work, saying she wouldn't come in today. David was taken aback. He didn't know where to start, and Claire noticed this. She beckoned the waiter and ordered a pint of Guinness and a glass of white wine. She looked quite determined. David had never seen her like this before. Then again, how would he know? He hadn't worked with her. They sat in silence, waiting for the drinks to arrive. Guinness takes a while to pour. Claire sat patiently and quietly, but tears were already rolling down her cheeks, which she wiped occasionally with a handkerchief. David took a sip of his Guinness. It seemed he drank half a pint at once. Claire waved to the waiter to bring more. Looking at David with sad eyes, she broke the silence and asked, "After our conversation at the party, you probably already guessed what it's about. Do you want me to tell the whole story, or will you just ask questions?" David's head was full of guesses, but pretending to feel the confidence he didn't actually have, he said, "You tell the story, and I'll ask questions as we go." Claire wiped her tears again. "As I said at that party, I needed more than Brian could give, and he didn't want to talk about it. I saw no way out. Richard simply fills that void. Damn, that's not what I meant, satisfies that need. It may be hard for you to believe, as it is for many men, but I can separate fun from love. Sometimes I want to be held, loved, and then wake up in the arms of a man who loves me. And sometimes I just need some good entertainment. Excuse me, this may be painful to hear. Brian still can't give me a second one. On Saturday, he was damn close to it. Richard is just fulfilling the second part. I didn't see any other way out except to stay with Brian and get the dose of entertainment I need. And before you ask, I don't work with him. I met him at a lawyer's meeting on the other side of town. He's married and has no intention of leaving his wife, and I'm just a side amusement for him. It may seem unreasonable, but it makes sense to me. Do you have any questions?" Claire suddenly asked in a businesslike tone, as if defending herself. David had a few questions, but he was trying to understand how much he really needed to know the answers. Which questions are important? Which answers matter? Some questions are irrelevant because I don't know what's important. For example, where you met him and who proposed. It doesn't matter where you met, but who took the first step? David asked. It's simple, Claire replied. He overheard me saying that I wouldn't mind some good entertainment. He turned to me and said, I could do that for such a beauty, just so my wife wouldn't find out. I thought he was joking. Later, he caught me as I was leaving the ladies' room, took my hand, and led me to one of the offices. I won't go into details, but I got what I asked for. Do you regret it? David asked. A tough question, Claire pondered. Do I regret you catching me? No. Part of me is glad I did it. Part of me is glad you gave me a reason to stop, even if Brian leaves me. Part of me regrets that I won't get good entertainment anymore. I will miss it. Do I regret having to deceive Brian? Yes, absolutely. I don't want to say anything about Brian because it's not his fault. It's all my actions. Will you continue this? David inquired. I don't know. But probably not, now that Brian has changed. We started talking with Brian, and on Sunday evening he listened to some of my suggestions. So I see a time when it will stop bothering me. Claire answered several of David's questions right away, even those he didn't know he wanted to ask. Do you love Brian? David asked. Claire unexpectedly replied, Despite what you've seen, I'll answer, yes, definitely. I plan to gather courage, and next time he proposes to me, I will say, yes. You will consider me a schemer and a deceiver, and of course, you will be right, Claire continued. You will also ask me if I would do it again. I have thought a lot about it, and if Richard had not taken the initiative, no. I would never seek such entertainment again. You probably want to ask if he is better than Brian. Yes, of course, he is better than Brian in terms of pure pleasure, but that's not an excuse. However, if Brian had taken the steps he took a week ago, none of this would have ever happened. Where is Margaret Thatcher in all this? He asked sarcastically. It seems you have a lot of experience in this matter. You answered all my questions as if you knew you would be caught. Claire lowered her eyes. No, I never expected to be caught. She looked up at David. How did you find us? David told how he noticed her with another man last week, and then followed them to the hotel. Damn, Claire cursed. One more question, David said. Why didn't you ask me not to tell Brian? This question seemed to catch Claire off guard. I wouldn't ask you to choose between me and him. I know you've been friends for life. She started crying again. Can I tell him myself? I will be honest. I can't let his best friend break such news to him. He paused, gathering his thoughts. Then he continued. If you swear to me on your mother's grave, and I know she is still alive, that you will never betray him, I won't tell him and will leave it up to you. I will still listen to both of you and help, because I love you both. Claire's expression changed as if the angel of death sitting on David's shoulder suddenly fell from his perch. Will you do this for me? For Brian and me? She asked with a trembling voice. Yes, I will do it for my dearest friends, but if you slip up again, I will tell everyone about it. Claire was openly crying, using one tissue after another. Yes, damn it, yes, anything, absolutely anything, Claire sobbed. Finally, David stood up. I need to leave urgently, he said. I am completely drained. This conversation has exhausted me. I have a rugby game on Sunday. Maybe we'll see each other there. Or maybe not. If you two aren't there as a couple tomorrow, well, then we'll see each other later. He left, paying for the drinks but leaving the tissues. It was done. Time to move on. He understood that at least Brian, under any circumstances, would always be there. David was sure of that. Sunday came. David and his teammates rushed out of the locker room, slapping each other on the back and shouting nicknames. At the foot of the stairs stood Brian and Claire with huge smiles on their faces. Brian was laughing joyfully and showing David 2 thumbs up. David didn't remember much about the game. They told him he ran like the wind, and they won the match. After that, David didn't see Claire and Brian for 2 weeks. They went on a countryside vacation. On Wednesday after their return, Brian called David and said he was inviting him to the club on Friday evening, without revealing the reason for the invitation. David agreed. In the club, there was soft music playing, more like background noise. David, Brian, and Claire were sitting in an alcove. Claire had a serious expression on her face, and David noticed that she hardly drank. She sat between them, and suddenly, when the music faded, she turned to Brian. Are you going to ask me? Claire said, looking straight into Brian's eyes. Ask what? He replied, bewildered. You know, that question you've been agonizing over for the past 6 months. Brian froze, realizing the moment had come. Awkwardly, he dropped to one knee and uttered, Claire Wolstenholme, will you do me the great honor of becoming my wife? Silence fell in the hall. All eyes were on them. Yes, yes, 1,000 times yes. Claire exclaimed, rushing into Brian's arms. David watched this scene with mixed feelings. He was happy for his friends, but somewhere deep down, he felt a pang of sadness. At some point, he took Claire aside and asked, I understand you've told him everything and resolved this situation? Yes, when we went on vacation. It was tough, but I managed to confess to him. Brian was really angry and left home, and I thought I had lost him forever, but he came back in the evening and hugged me tightly and kissed me. That day, we vowed to always be faithful to each other, despite all the difficulties. 6 months later, Brian and Claire got married. At the wedding, David met the bride's friend named Harriet. They started dating, and David was quite content with the relationship. When Brian and Claire's son Daniel was born, David was appointed as his godfather. After the christening, he proposed to Harriet, but she turned him down and left, leaving David completely puzzled. Years passed. David had other relationships, but none lasted more than a couple of years. He resigned himself to the thought that he would probably remain a bachelor, yet he was rarely alone. His best friends were always by his side. Daniel joined the army, which made David very proud of his godson. When David turned 53, he realized he was already too old for rugby. His body no longer recovered as quickly as before. One day, Brian called and asked to meet at an old pub on the other side of town. They hadn't met there since Brian suspected that Claire was cheating on him. The request made David wary. When he arrived, Brian was already sitting in the same alcove where they had sat many years ago. He looked worn out and dejected, with an equally worn-out Claire sitting next to him. David understood that the conversation wouldn't be about infidelity. You look terrible, buddy. Is everything okay? David asked with concern. Actually, no. Everything is very bad, Brian replied. David realized he was about to hear something unpleasant. I've been diagnosed with leukemia. I have a month left. No more, Brian said. David felt the ground slipping from under him. Is there really nothing that can be done? David asked, rubbing his temples. Claire shook her head. No, it's already too late. We didn't know he had this. He just felt tired, so we went to bed early. When he woke up in that condition last week, I made him go to the doctor. He refused, saying it was because of work, that he was just tired. The next 3 weeks were dreadful. A week before Brian's death, David visited him in the hospital. Brian handed him an envelope and asked David not to open it until he left. There were many people at the funeral. Colleagues, mutual friends, and relatives. David stood with Claire, silently watching as his friend's body was lowered into the grave. Claire asked David about the envelope, and he showed her that it was in the inner pocket of his jacket, but he wouldn't open it yet. A month passed. Claire called David and asked for help moving the beds for Daniel. When the work was done, they sat in the kitchen, sipping cold beer. Uncle David, Daniel suddenly said. He hadn't called him that since he joined the army. You haven't read the letter yet, have you? David shook his head. No. And as long as the letter remains unopened, it seems like a part of him is still here. Daniel looked at him closely. It's not about that. Do you know what's inside? I don't know, I think mostly gratitude, David replied. I think Mom wants me to open it, he said. Tension hung in the air. The mystery of Brian's final message weighed on both of them, but David still wasn't ready to find out its contents. David promised his godson to read the letter as soon as he returned home. After drinking a few more glasses of beer, he set off. Claire asked him to let her know when he would be arriving. She was worried that after drinking, he might not make it home. David sent her a message. At home, he poured himself a large glass of gin and tonic, with much more gin than tonic. This won't be easy, he thought, opening the letter. It was handwritten, with a few crossed-out words. David began to read, and memories flooded back to him. The first cigarette they secretly smoked behind the trash can. Pooling pocket money to pay for the broken glass in the greenhouse. The old wreck of a car they got stuck in overnight in Skegness, shivering from the cold. But the most touching was the mention of Claire. That's when I realized she was the one, his friend wrote. Thanks to you, and despite all the difficulties, I lived a wonderful life with a beautiful woman, he confessed. Finishing the gin, David leaned back in his chair. He was moved, feeling both sadness and happiness. This letter was a true treasure, a testament to years of friendship that helped him become who he is. You loved Claire, but our friendship was more important to you, the next paragraph in Brian's letter read. You pushed those feelings away, buried them deep inside. But Harriet saw it, as did many other girls. That's why they didn't stay with you. They loved you, but couldn't share you with anyone else. David trembled. Was this really true? Had he truly been hiding his feelings for Claire all this time to not hurt Brian? In the letter, Brian asked David to take care of Claire and gave his blessing for their relationship, but asked to wait a year and a day after the funeral to not shock the parents. She is a warm, wonderful woman. So please, don't wait a whole year to solidify your love, wrote Brian. David finished his gin and tonic, almost choking. Suddenly, he felt a hand on his shoulder and nearly jumped in surprise. Turning around, he saw Claire. She was crying. We were right, she said quietly. Do you love me? David froze, unsure of what to say. He looked into Claire's eyes, filled with tears and hope, and realized he could no longer deny the truth. David pushed Claire away at arm's length. She tilted her head slightly and smiled, her face glowing. You're still trying to hide it, she said softly. Let me make it easier for you. Since that day at the party, I've been falling more and more in love with you, and it has eventually grown into true love. Don't get me wrong. I love Brian much more, but who wouldn't love a man for everything you've done for us? David felt his heart beating faster. He didn't mind being second to Brian in her heart. Claire took his hand and led him to the stairs, looking at him tenderly. I think it's time, she whispered. It was a party between Christmas and New Year's, where almost everyone was gathered. David's parents, Brian's parents, Claire's parents, as well as Daniel with his wife and children. It seemed like everyone was expecting something important. 3 fathers of David cornered him, as if trapping him. Brian's father, Jonathan, looked him straight in the eyes. "When are you going to propose to her?" "What are you talking about?" David tried to evade. "To ask Claire to marry you, of course," Claire's father interjected. "It's obvious to everyone except you. Daniel can't wait anymore. You've been part of the family for so long that this will be the final step. You won't replace his father, you're an additional bonus. Like he has 2 dads." David gave in. "Jonathan, Brian wrote me a letter before he passed away. He told me things about myself that I didn't know. And yes, I will propose to her. But he asked me to wait for a year and a day because he didn't want to upset you. He wasn't sure how you would react to it." "Listen, son," intervened David's father, "you have our full blessing. Don't wait. Don't waste time. After all, we are not young either." They let him go. David returned to the living room, and silence reigned there. He glanced around the room. Everyone was looking at him. It was a devilishly well-planned trap by Claire. Brian's mother approached him and placed something in his hand. David looked down. It was an engagement ring. "I'll lend it to you until you buy your own," she said with a smile. David was about to approach Claire, but suddenly she was next to him. He knelt down and silently uttered the cherished words. Claire reached out her hand to him, and when he put the ring on her finger, the room exploded with joyful cries. "Not very romantic," whispered David, kissing Claire. "Was all this arranged?" "Everything," she replied with a mischievous smile. "Who do you think organized it?" "I love you." They got married 6 weeks later. David told Daniel never to call him dad or uncle. And he never called him dad, but to tease, sometimes called him uncle with a smile on his face. After all these years, David realized that yes, he truly loved Claire, and he understood that genuine feelings for her began to emerge after she was honest with him about the affair at the hotel. He was struck by Claire's honesty and how she tried to save his friendship with Brian. And now, after so many years, he looked at her, at his friend's wife, and then his own wife, and realized that he was truly happy now. If you're over 18, don't miss the upcoming story and remember to click the like button to show your support. Thank you.